early September, 8:30 p.m. Central Time. If you are listening to this at a later date, we are recording on Wednesday, September 11th, 8:30 p.m. So anything we say, if you're listening to it later on, is within the context of this date and this time. And as always, we are brought to you by the coolest dive bar in the state of Tennessee. The Downtown Tavern, 208 North Liberty Street, is the only dive bar that I know of that serves an all-vegan menu. So I don't know where else you can get that, right? Some Benchmark House bourbon and a vegan burger. Not too many places serve that. If you're ever coming through Jackson, you've got to stop at the stalwart of downtown, the Downtown Tavern, 208 North Liberty Street. Tonight, my guest is Danny Song. Danny's a CEO of Give Services, a commercial services company with a mission to give back. Give Services is a national reach with primary businesses located in Memphis, Tennessee, and Dallas, Texas. Prior to his role at Give Services, Danny worked 15 years in urban education as a teacher, school leader, leading to his role as founder and executive director of Believe Memphis Academy Charter School. During his leadership, the students of Believe achieved the highest possible ratings of growth in math and literacy every year. The state test was administered, making Believe the only charter school in Memphis and one of 3 public schools in Shelby County School District to achieve that status during that time period. Danny's a 2015 and 2017 recipient of the National, I'm going to say this wrong, Sontag Prize in Urban Education, 2019 recipient of Alumni of Distinction in Nonprofits by Union University, 2023 recipient of the New Memphis Educator of Excellence Award. Danny holds a BA in journalism and an MA in urban education from Union University. And you are coming to me from my old stomping grounds of the DFW airport in
right.
Dallas, Texas. Thank you.
But man, I wish we were at the tavern now. I wish we were at the downtown Jackson next time I come. They definitely didn't have that when I was living in Jackson. So I'm excited about stopping by next time.
It's a cool spot. You should definitely do it. Danny, thank you so much for joining me. I know it's with travel, it can be complicated. I appreciate your flexibility. Man, reading your biography.
I was so excited to be invited. I was really honored. So I've seen a few of your posts and things that you've written on, Gabe. So it's really fun to meet you. And it sounds like I just followed your educational pathway. I mean, from JCM to Union, and just following the footsteps and the trails blazed by Gabe Hart.
Those are not steps you probably want to follow. You've made your way pretty well. I was reading your bio. I was like, oh man, I glanced over at it when I typed it into the Facebook post, but reading out loud, I was like, oh, I'm a little intimidated now. So talk to me a little bit about, you ended up, well, I'll let you get there, right?
Yeah.
But I listened to a former podcast you recorded recently, and you lived a little bit of everywhere growing up, correct?
But as you even did the intro and you named that today is September 11th, it took me back to where I was on 9/11, and I was in the auditorium of JCM and on the West Campus. What was that auditorium called? Do you remember?
Oh, put me on the spot. I can visualize it. I can even smell it.
You know what I'm talking about. So, yeah. So I was on the West Campus of JCM in the auditorium. There's literally like this JCM alumni who was getting his jersey retired from like football. Like he was a pro. I think he played for the Broncos or something. So we were at this assembly where the guy who's a JCM alum was getting his jersey retired. And then we flow out. So I was missing class. I was excited about that. And then we flow out. I walk in and this is before smartphones. Nobody had phones, man. I walk into my U.S. history class and the TV is on and everybody's so quiet and somber. And I was like, what are we doing? Are we watching a movie today? And they're like, no, like this is happening live. And so that just introduction of recognizing what today is reminded me of where I was, which happened to be in Jackson, Tennessee. So, man, I'll start with how I got there. Just kind of started my life. I was born in Seoul, South Korea. My parents, both Korean, met in college. And my dad wanted to continue his studies. He was one of the first in his family to go to college. He was the first to go to grad school. And then he had the opportunity to continue his studies. And so we moved to America. So they got married a year after they graduated college. They had me a year after that. And then he had an opportunity to study abroad in America. And so we came here and he enrolled at Northwestern University. And he, for the next 6 years, worked on his PhD on chemical engineering. So the early part of my life was in Chicago, suburb of Chicago. My brother and my sister were born there. I started preschool, kindergarten, and first grade in Chicago, public school, and then my dad graduated from Northwestern. And so we were here on his student visa, and we moved. So once he graduated, we moved back to Korea, where I did elementary school, second, third, and fourth. The plan long term was for my parents. They wanted to raise us in America. And so we made a pit stop in Canada, lived in 2 years for Toronto and Ottawa, fifth and sixth grade for me. And then eventually got our green card and moved down to Raleigh, North Carolina, where I finished middle school. Sixth grade, I went to 3 different cities for sixth grade. Started in Toronto, moved to Ottawa, then finished in North Carolina. Went to a magnet school when I was in middle school. There was a public magnet school, year-round school, interesting experience. And then my 8th grade year, my dad got laid off from his job, and he was, entered a period of uncertainty for us. He was looking for jobs and finally got a job at the Maytag plant in Jackson. So we moved to Jackson summer before my 9th grade year. And man, that's what brought us to Jackson. But I want to pause here and just talk about like the early part of my life and childhood were so much surrounded around education. I mean, my parents from the other side of the world believed and that education could unlock opportunity, not only for themselves, but for future generations like me and my brother and sister. So they would make this entire crazy bet that, hey, we're going to leave everything we know and we're going to leave everyone we know and go to this country where we barely speak the language, because if we get an education from that country, it'll change our lives. And man, for a lot of part of my life and for my siblings, that bet paid off for my parents. But, I think as I've gotten into public education, and I think the topic that we're going to talk about today is for how many kids born in this country that bet doesn't pay off for, that promise of what this country can provide doesn't work for so many children who are born right here in our country. As we call it, proverbial, maybe born on the other side of the tracks, but literally in our country. So I just talk a little bit of my exposure to Jackson. My first time I'm stepping onto my high school campus, I'm meeting with my guidance counselor there, and she kind of looks at my transcript from North Carolina, and she says, well, at this high school, and it was at Jackson Central Mary High, go Cougars, and she said, at this high school, we have 2 tracks. We have the college prep track and the vocational track. I'm looking at your transcript here. I'm assuming you're going to be on the college prep track. And I said, yes, ma'am. And I thought that was weird, but I'd lived in the South long enough that I knew to say ma'am at least. And I said, yes, ma'am. And she kind of goes on to enroll me in AP and honors courses, that would put me on the college track. And, I think back to that moment and I think like, man, what if I looked different? Like, this was their first time meeting me. What if my mom wasn't there with me? What if I was a different color or a different race? Would she have assumed something differently? Would she have said, hey, I'm going to sign it. We have a great vocational tech program here. And I think about the decisions that we subconsciously, unconsciously quickly make on behalf of children that affect the rest of their lives. So let me pause there. That's how I kind of got to Jackson.
Let me ask you this, because all the places that you listed where you live, Canada, Chicago, suburban Chicago, even Raleigh, right? That's a considerably larger city than Jackson. And even though North Carolina would be considered the South, like Tennessee, that's sort of a deeper level of the South in my mind. What was it? Was that transition tough? And also at the end of your 8th grade year, like what a pivotal age and of course you've moved around a lot, but was it a big adjustment culturally coming to Jackson from those places?
By the time I moved to Jackson, I had, done cross-country moves at least, half a dozen times. And so I think I was old enough and aware enough that I knew, one, that it was going to be okay. Like I had transitioned languages, I had moved countries, I had different cities and cultures. I was pretty confident in my survival skills that I was going to figure this thing out. But I will say, yes, you're right. Jackson was the smallest city we ever lived in. And for me, the first and most shocking thing that I experienced when I moved to Jackson is it was the first time I ever saw the Confederate flag in real life. I realized then, like, I was in a different part of the South. And for whatever the Confederate flag may represent for different people and our different listeners and people who live in West Tennessee, and many of my best friends wore it on their T-shirts. For me, it represented danger. For me, it represented fear. And for me, it represented a place where I was not going to have power. And so that was a signal to me of how I need to carry myself, how I need to create safety for myself. And I would say big things that happened in Jackson from my move is it was the first city we ever lived in that I didn't have a Korean church to attend. So even when we lived in Chicago, when we lived in Toronto, Ottawa, Raleigh, I was surrounded by people who didn't look like me at school, in my neighborhood, but I always went to church with people who looked like me and spoke my language and from my home culture. Jackson was the first place we didn't have that. And so the way that impacted me, I would say more on a cultural and social level, is it really taught me a great level of the need for assimilation into whatever the majority culture was. And for me, because I was in the college prep track at JCM, and because I was going to an all-white church that became a white community. And so, most of my friends were white. Most of my friends were Southern Baptist. And so those represented, and like you said, real times of when you're forming your identity. That was a big part of that journey for me, is kind of the pillars of faith, which was always a big part of my life, but also just the social dynamics.
You mentioned, or when you were talking to the counselor and you're looking back at that, and you said, what if I looked different? What if my mom had? I went to JCM like you did. I graduated in 97. And I know, looking back on nearly 30 years later, you tend to view things through rosier colored glasses. I look at JCM back in 97, maybe in a way that's not totally realistic, but to me, it was a wonderfully
peak era
school, golden era. You mentioned the player getting his jersey retired. I was there with Al Wilson when he was there, and it was such a time when I was in it. I don't think I knew how fortunate I was to be at that large of a high school with that many successful programs. That being said, even though we housed a lot of diversity within those two campuses in Ulman Arena, you mentioned the tracks. And I can think back also to my honors classes that I was in as well. And I got excellent teaching from my teachers and things like that. But most of the people that were in those classes tended to look like I did, even though there was a racial balance within the school as a whole. There wasn't that balance within the tracks, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Well, those of us who went to JCM, know, right? The history of JCM was Jackson High School and Jackson Central and Mary High School that were combined. The all black and the all white school that were put together in the 70s. And I think the legacies of that integration, while it happened in name, I think continued to hold true the whole time that we were there. Depend where you sit in the cafeteria, when you transition classes, but whether you walk on the parking lot or the crosswalk, right? Whether you stand, which hallways you're using, all of those were social cues that being a newbie and being neither white or black, I had to observe, and I had to kind of pick sides. I had to pick which way was I going to walk, where was I going to sit, where was I going to park my car, all those things. And again, because my social circles were majority white, that's just the way that I kind of ended up moving. But man, I think you're right. And I look back at JCM really fondly, and between my sophomore year at JCM, this was in 2002, 2003, they started talking about Madison Academic. They're going to create it Madison Academic. And man, JCM had graduating classes around that time of around 400. Kids were going everywhere to college. Again, when I was there, soccer, football, band. I mean, teachers who were teaching there were graduates of JCM, had pride of the city and the school. The academic decathlon team had just won like a national award. Shout out to Miss Luna, U.S. history teacher and world history teacher, and the academic decathlon coach. So, but when they started talking about the creation of Madison, like we as students, I remember talking about like many of us didn't want it. Yeah, many of us knew what we were about to lose, and quite frankly, many of us could see through what they were talking about. They were like, "Oh, so they're just resegregating the schools." I mean, even as high schoolers, we talked about that. We talked about, okay, so all the white kids are going to go to Madison, black kids are going to stay at JCM. And while that's a hyperbole of some sorts, it kind of played out. I mean, between Liberty and Madison opening around those times. And what I think, as I look back on my time at JCM, I experienced academic rigor. I experienced enriching athletics. I experienced a lot of opportunity, clubs, societies, athletics. And I would say that, and I know I'm probably jumping ahead here, but I would say the creation of Madison and me graduating from Madison was actually a deterioration of my educational experience, both from a pride standpoint of, man, I wanted to graduate from JCM, to just an actual experience. I mean, for example, like Madison, we didn't really have that many sports programs. We didn't have as many opportunity, I thought. And I think those of us who graduated from Madison I would say was worse. I felt like I was worse off. I don't think I was better off because I went to Madison. I don't think my graduating class was better off because we went to Madison. But I'll tell you one thing, JCM was far worse off because of the kids and the teachers who left JCM. So I think oftentimes decisions are made trying to preserve, protect, or advantage certain kids, families, whatever. And I think sometimes we have it backwards when it comes to policy. I think we try to protect middle class, upper class families, and I think all the studies actually show like integration and racial diversity and socioeconomic diversity doesn't ever hurt middle class kids, but the lack thereof significantly hurts impoverished and more vulnerable children.
I completely agree. And I want to ask you this, and it's not off script because it's going along with the train of conversation that we're in right now. We have a graduation coach at JCM where I work currently who does an excellent job of showing the history of Mary High, the integration process, taking it all the way up to when Madison was formed. And there is this idea that at every step of the way, and I don't know how intentional any of this is. I think it's systemic. And I think when things are systemic, most of the decisions are made on a subconscious level because it's just the way the system is, and people don't want to take the time to think about difficult topics. And so they kowtow to, like you said, people of upper middle class persuasion, and they make decisions based on them without thinking of the ramifications of that. But in this presentation that she does, there is a history of Mary High or JCM sort of getting the shaft all the way up to they had to close it in 2016.
Right.
And we reopened it just 2 or 3 years ago. And it's been, man, I can't tell you how excited I am to be part of it because it's a lot of work. But man, like every year we get better and better and better. We add more things. Our football team's 3-0 now. I mean,
Let's
and
go.
I know, but it's a huge thing for high school, right? So let me ask you this: those decisions that are made, especially when it comes to education, how much of the systemic issues that especially the American South has impact public education and the decisions that are made either at a district level or hell, even a state level? I mean, is that too broad of a question?
Man, it is a broad question, but I think we can try to. I mean, let's chew it one bite at a time. One thing that I'm thinking about, I mean, first of all, like as you talk about JCM, I mean, hearing from afar while I was in Memphis at the time. The closure of JCM was heartbreaking. But I would say even in 2005, when I graduated, and my classmates who were split between JCM and Madison, I could see already the impact negatively that it was having. And I think at the time that those decisions were made, a lot of the thought that was shared with us is we got to keep middle class families from choosing private schools. How do we make sure that middle class families feel like they have a place in the public education system? And so let's create these alternative places. And so I don't think anybody in those boardrooms, in those districts, were thinking like harm or ill will to JCM. I think they were really trying to say, like, how can we create a world-class education system where people have different options, opportunities, where, we have VOTEC options, we have college prep options, we have all of these things. The principal that we brought on for Madison at the time, I think, had a great vision. I think there's a lot of excitement surrounding it. But I think sometimes you brought up the word systemic, and I know that word can be just a turnoff to some people. Be like, all right, I know what this is about. I know what you're talking about. But I think, look, I've lived in 3 countries and 7 cities, and I'm telling you, like, culture impacts the way we think. Language impacts the way we think. I'm a bilingual person. I think differently in Korean than I do in English. And I can like tell that in my brain. I like culturally process events differently depending on which language I'm speaking at the time or where I am. And so I think it is naive of us to think that we're not impacted by the history and the socialization and what we see. So if you're living today, nobody living today had anything to do with slavery. But we still see the legacy impacts of decisions that were made long time ago. I think back on each of those periods of history that we learn about in school, and we think like, oh man, those are such foolish or short-sighted decisions. And yet, like, it's kind of like when you read the Bible and you look at the Israelites and you say to yourself, oh man, those Israelites were idiots. Like, how could they doubt God? I mean, clearly they just crossed the Red Sea. How could they doubt that God could provide? Why would they not trust that he would provide manna for the next day? We are living that every day of our lives, right? If you're a person of faith, you live the Israelite journey every single day, and only by the grace of Jesus do we have any sort of redemption. And so for us to think that we're somehow that much more enlightened or evolved than people who made decisions to own slaves back in the early parts of America to today, when we live in still very racially segregated cities and systems, I think it's a delusion that we've convinced ourselves. I think what we have made racism harder to see, and I think we have made racism harder to identify. And so I think the average person growing up in America today may feel confused if we don't do intentional study on why certain neighborhoods look the way they do, why certain schools look the way they do. By the way, the reopening of JCM was so exciting. I was actually working with an architect here in Memphis at the time, who was our architect designing the redesign of Believe Memphis Academy, who has also had the project of designing JCM Early College High. So I was just pumped to hear from there what she was doing, and the excitement that she had about that. I don't even know that we scratched the surface of your question, though.
No, but that's okay. I think that's the reason I like these conversations so much, because it made me think of another question, and I want to get your take before we sort of move down the road in this public education conversation. I always struggle to parse out race and socioeconomic class when it comes to discussing things like education or education or data from education for standardized tests and things, because there is so much research that says if you are in a lower socioeconomic class, generally you will not have as much success on these tests as someone else. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So when all of this sort of shakes out in the South specifically, a lot of times minorities fall into that lower socioeconomic class more so than, lighter skinned people.
Yeah.
I believe a lot of that, and I don't think it's much of a leap to make, is because of what we just talked about, right? The way
Yeah.
that the systems have been in our country for
Yeah.
so long. And look, the 1960s wasn't that long ago. It was a
Mm,
generation, right?
right. Right.
I have argued this, oh, and I shouldn't even say argue, tried to explain over and over and over. Course correction takes a long time, and we may never get there, but it sure as hell doesn't happen in 60 years. After you have 300 years on the other side of that, where
Yeah.
there were no
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there is this idea, like, people don't like the word equity. People say
Mm,
everybody has the same opportunity, and I just completely
mm,
disagree with that. But I also think that there are ways to bridge those gaps, but for some reason, with the tenor of society and the way people are very sensitive to certain words like systemic or privilege or things like that, we
mm.
tend to tense up when we hear those words, and then it
Sure.
almost makes it harder to fill in some of those gaps, if that makes sense. um, let me ask you this, and this is sort of a jump, but I kind of want to move this ahead. You majored in journalism at
Yeah.
Union. How in the world did you get into education as
Yeah.
a major in journalism? Like,
Yeah.
when did that first, like, kind of pop in your head? This is something you wanted to do.
Yeah. Well, there's so much that I want to, I feel like hooks to grab onto on things that
Okay.
you were sharing. And I just want to, I guess I want to say this thing. You were an English teacher. And that's funny you mentioned my background because I was going to go to you too. It's like, you were an English teacher, right? And I taught English for a while as well. I mean, one, we can appreciate as English teachers the power of language and how words have connotations. Like when you talk about equity, I mean, it's just a word, right? Privilege is a word, but man, it does carry some weight. Um, what it makes me think about is, again, like, one, I want to like in all those moves, I just want to name for your audience, like, faith has always been a very important part of my life, no matter where I lived. Coming to the South, Bible Belt, all of those things, that part felt the most familiar to me. Like having religion and all of those, Christianity be such a clear part of social culture. So when I make biblical references and things like that, I just want to acknowledge like that's not just because of context. It's truly like an outflow of me. But I think there's some I think even that religion also takes on cultural lenses. Again, because I've lived in 3 countries and multiple cities, I've seen that happen. But one story that comes to mind when we talk about the challenge of language is the Tower of Babel, right? I mean, what humans can do if we all get on the same page and sync in language. Literally, the Bible says there's nothing these people cannot do. But then, as part of the curse and the fall, like language was confused. And I think coming back to the miracle of Pentecost in Acts, when Peter speaks and everyone hears in their own language the gospel presented to them and they come to faith in Christ, like I think this right here, the tension that we're talking about of words being misused and weaponized for one another, that causes confusion. I think that's more than anything anti-Christian, and I think it's something that we can all challenge each other to think more about of how do we like seek to understand one another rather than make judgments and try to separate each other based on the words that we use. So that being said, going back to your yes, and I think because of the appreciation of both language and the power of storytelling, I changed my major to journalism. So I was an English major at Union at first. I actually started as a business major because my youth minister in high school was a business major, and I wanted to grow up to be just like him. So I decided to major in business. But then, yeah, I took microeconomics, and I was like, nope, not doing that. So I changed to English, and that was really fun. But as I was ironically kind of hitting my sophomore year, going into my junior year, um, one day there was a professor at Union in my creative writing class, and he said, "How many of you all plan to teach after college?" And about more than half the class raised their hand. And I was like, "Oh, I'm in the wrong major because I don't want to be a teacher." So I changed to journalism because I wanted to stay in the language and the humanities and all that. I know that at that time the plan was to get to law school after college and kind of build a career from there. But as I was getting into journalism, one of the things that really interested me was social justice issues. I mean, issues of struggle, issues of human struggle, issues of systems, issues of power dynamics. And I started getting really interested in those topics. And then my senior year, I heard of a program called the Memphis Teacher Residency. And it was just opening up. It was in its first year. That was in 2009. And that the MTR was about to launch in Memphis. And I heard its vision, its mission, which was that urban education is the greatest civil rights and social justice issue facing America today. And I was hooked. And I thought, oh, I got to learn more about this. And I just remember coming down to Memphis, interviewing for being a part of the class. It was the first class. It was in Memphis. It was social justice related. I mean, it was faith-based. It was all the things that made me believe, like, this is exactly what it makes no sense in the world. My wife currently, who I've been married to since, and we were dating at Union. When I came back from Memphis and I told her I'm doing the MTR, she said, "You're crazy, and there's no way, this was never a part of the plan, right?" But I just was convinced. I came back to Union. I was convinced that that's exactly what I was supposed to do. So I think called is the right word. And so I moved to Memphis after college, graduated, and joined the MTR. I thought it would be I thought law school was the long term. So I thought, like, hey, I'll do this thing as a 4-year commitment. I'll get a master's out of it. I'll get some real world experience. I'll be able to polish up my resume, study for the LSAT, all those things. And then I'll go. And, I ended up staying for 15 years. I just couldn't find, my first year teaching, I'll do a quick story and then turn back. My first year teaching, I was in the teacher workroom with a 50-year Teach for America alum, which before MTR, I'd never heard of TFA either. But I was talking to the TFA alum. She was from the University of Michigan, and she kind of had a similar pathway. She was like, yeah, I thought about law school after college. And I was like, oh, well, why didn't you go? Because I was still in my first year. And she said, well, I finished my TFA commitment, but then I just couldn't picture myself doing anything more important. And it stuck with me. And I think for the last 15 years, and still to this day, like, it's hard for me to conceptualize anything more important that we could be involved in than the fight for public education equity in our country right now.
The way you described that for the program where you started, I want you to repeat that, because I was trying to remember it and I'm going to butcher it. You said urban education was the single biggest civil rights issue?
Urban education is the greatest civil rights and social justice issue facing America today.
Can you parse that out a little bit? Like what did they mean by that? Why, for people listening that maybe like, what, that doesn't make any sense. Why did they say it that way?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, it's the tyranny of the present and feeling like this just rules everything. Like, we forget that the civil rights movement happened in the 60s. People are alive today who lived through that. And that before that was 250 years. The slavery was outlawed 1865, which was 200 years after enslaved people were brought to this country. So literally there's 200 years of history of slavery. Then after slavery is outlawed during after the Civil War period that they call the Reconstruction era, you pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that give the right to vote, that give the right to that outlaw slavery and all of those things. But an immediate backlash of the Reconstruction movement was the Jim Crow era of the South, where the separate but equal becomes the ruling law of the land. And this actually, not to give the South all of the credit, this actually was a law that came out of Boston, Massachusetts, where there was a father of a young girl, Sarah Roberts, who was trying to get his child, she would have to walk past all white schools to go to her school. That was an all black school. And so the father sued the city. And in that city, the city upheld that they had a right to do that. And that went all the way to the Massachusetts State Supreme Court. And they ruled there the ruling of separate but equal. And then the separate but equal was used as the precedent for Plessy versus Ferguson with the rail cars in, again, the late 1860s, 70s. And so that separate but equal becomes doctrine in the United States, where literally you can create separate schools, separate housing, separate everything for the next 100 years. And it's not until Brown versus Board of Education in 1965, I believe, again, that is overturned. And that turns over that the ruling justice is that statement is that separate is inherently unequal. And one of the case studies that were brought forward in that trial were children's perceptions of themselves based on the color of dolls that they put in front of kids and say, is this a good baby or a bad baby? And they would put a black doll in front of the child, and they would say that's a bad one. And they put a white doll in front of the baby, and they say that's a good one. And they use that study to make this case that this separation is creating a second-class citizen tier in our country, and it's a harm that is unlikely to be undone. Right? That's literally what they say. And so then you have integration. And the interesting thing that happened in America during that time is a whole lot more separation. Creation of private schools was one of those things that boomed in the 60s and 70s following Brown versus Board of Education. You have the white flight into the suburbs. Memphis, Tennessee was a 2/3 white city until 1968. And by 1973, after federally mandated busing, it flipped to a 2/3 black city, and it's been that ever since. Memphis is the largest majority black city in America, but it became that way in the late 60s, early 70s during the white flight era following Brown versus Board of Education. So when you talk about equality of citizenship, education has always been a cornerstone of this. But not only is that happening, as this continues to progress, now we live in a society starting, I would say, in the 80s, 90s, especially 2000 for sure, where really the attainment of a college degree becomes the gatekeeper to a middle class life. Prior to then, there was a lot of opportunities to get into middle class life without a college degree. Not very many people had college degrees, right? Even a couple of generations ago, most people didn't have college degrees. But we have now lived in an era where the income earning potential of a high school graduate to a college graduate is so significant that children born in poverty are very unlikely to make it out of poverty unless they get a college degree. And we see now the exacerbated gaps in opportunity starting all the way, the first kind of measured times is third grade reading scores, which we can talk about that, but third grade literacy scores, where you can, this is a well-known study at this point, you can predictably build prisons based on children's literacy rates in third grade. Speculating 20 years from there is how many prison beds you're going to need, because we can more predictably predict how many kids who can't read on grade level will end up in prison than in college or in a career. So when we say civil rights and we think about the opportunity to participate in the civics and in the opportunities of this country, education has to be a part of that conversation.
And that is something that is cyclical, right? Because if you were born in, and I'm gonna sort of bring this back to your personal story that you told earlier. Your parents clearly said the best chance in education is to leave everything that we've known, and literally move across the world to get you all an education. Right. And obviously they were able to do that. I'm sure that was really hard. I do believe, and there's a New York Times study about every county, if you are born into poverty, the chance that you have of getting out. I think Madison County was like 0.1%, right? Wow. So it wasn't even 1%. If you were born in poverty in Madison County, you have like 0.1% chance of getting out of that. At what point does this turn like cyclical? And maybe it already is, where we're just going to repeat the same things over and over and over, and that gap continues to widen and widen and widen. Haves and have-nots, right? The people who can't afford to send their kid to either a private school or to let them take the ACT as much as they can to get a super score that's going to get them more money off, and compared to the kids maybe who are, in public school or a lower socioeconomic class who will take that ACT 2 times because it's provided by the district for free. and that's the balance is really out of whack. And I'm saying that just as like that's the situation in Jackson right now. I'm sure it's like that in Memphis, where I know there's a special school district where Arlington has their own special school district, and they pulled out. Has that been what's that been like for the community there? You live there. Was that a big thing when that happened? Did that create like a vast amount of more inequity, or was it already on the way?
Well, it's a huge thing. It's literally a case study that colleges study now of what happened in 2014 in Memphis and Shelby County school systems. And again, when we talk about when we think about kind of these things as ancient history, like this happened in 2011 when the municipalities all create their own districts because a specific law changed. And again, I need to brush up on my dates and history on that. But what I know is that there was a law in place in the state of Tennessee that outlawed these specific municipalities from creating their own school system, because that law was put in place to protect the county at large, because they knew if they separated that the resources would be pulled away from the city schools and the urban districts where kids who had less inherent opportunity would further exacerbate that. That law changed. And when that law changed, municipalities saw an opportunity to create their own districts. Memphis city school system went as far as surrendering its charter to the county in a Hail Mary attempt to keep the district. And so that's why Memphis city schools changed to Shelby County schools, is because we surrendered our charter as a city in order to keep the Shelby County status. And so that did work, but the municipalities still created their own districts. So you have an Arlington, a Lakeland, a Germantown, literally 7 out of 7. All municipalities did it, and they created their own districts. And so I think it was, I don't know, honestly, that it made things that much worse because they were already pretty bad. But I think it was a very clear message to the urban districts of Memphis City that you're on your own. We are going to create our own. We're going to do our own. From an efficiency standpoint, it's really inefficient, right? To have your own superintendent, to have your own board, to have your own. But I think we sometimes get allured by the temptation of kind of just looking out for ourselves, our own neighbors, our immediate community, that we kind of lose sight. And again, the fact that those communities are unseen are not accidental. I mean, there was literal redlining laws that required where certain people could live. And it does become cyclical because many people know, most public education is funded through property taxes. And so got a nice house with a more significant property tax, there's more funding available for the students in that school community. You don't, there's less.
Right.
And so I think those ties, right? They weren't built accidentally. They were built purposefully. And if we look at the time period in which they were built, we know from history kind of what were the priorities then. So I think we have got to take on the responsibility of the current generation of figuring out, what do we want to be true 20, 50, 100 years from now? What can we start doing now to implement those changes rather than continue just in the current way things are?
When you were teaching in Memphis, right, urban education in Memphis, what were the biggest challenges that you faced as a classroom teacher in that environment? As far as just simply, as far as just teaching, when you walked in there with I'm assuming no student teaching experience, or maybe they trained you a little bit before, but what were those first few years like, and what were the biggest challenges you faced?
I think I want to pause here because people, I suppose, would assume that the biggest challenges would be the kids. And I would say they were the biggest joy working with the students that I get to work with. working with the families was incredibly inspiring because they reminded me of my parents. All the sacrifices that parents were making to try to give their kid every inch that they could give of a leg up than what they had. And yet, they were significantly challenged situations. My kids, once they started to learn to trust me, would tell me what it was like living in their neighborhoods, what it was like at home. Many of them lived in really desperate situations. Many of them lived in neighborhoods that they did not feel safe in, and nobody listening to this would feel safe being in. And I think we want to sometimes write those off and demonize. It's like, oh, it's that group of people over there making bad choices, and they're reaping the. But I would argue back and say, what are the choices that are available? I mean, what real choices that you talked about in Madison County? There's a 0.1% chance of escaping poverty. I mean, people need money. Like, what do you expect people to do who have no alternative recourse? And I think that in spite of that, every day I walked into a school, I was met with kids who had hope, optimism, who had resilience, who had character, who had grit, who had kindness, and all of those things. And I'm going to say, and it wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough for what kids needed and what they deserved. I think the amount of emotional and mental stress that poverty puts on children. I mean, let's think about this for a second. When we talk about change and when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, there's some famous studies that come to mind, like the Memphis 13 or the Little Rock 9. I mean, it's literally first graders, 6-year-olds, a handful of them, going into all white schools with adults picketing and adults like protesting and threatening. People in Fraser and Memphis buried a school bus, right? Like real threats happening, and children are walking into these situations, and we're putting pressure on kids to fix adult issues. So right now we can look at kids in poverty and say, hey, you get yourself out, you fix it. And I think we're again putting pressure on children to figure out problems that they didn't create. And it's unfair for us to expect of them. And quite frankly, I think it exposes like an issue on our end. Like, what's our moral fortitude and willingness to do something to help children who are innocent and who have no other options? I think this is, again, a way that this is playing out today is what's happening in our state legislation when it comes to gun reform or lack thereof, gun control and gun control laws. So recently, last year, they passed a law in the state legislature saying teachers can carry firearms in schools now as a measure of self-protection. Are you kidding me? Like, the response to the prevalence of school shootings is, okay, teachers, arm yourselves now. Like, the message is we've given up trying to fight it. School shootings are gonna happen. Teachers better strap up. Like, that's the solution, because we're unwilling to take on the harder and more important work of gun control, which most people on both sides would agree. Most gun owners I know are totally fine with common sense gun control laws, are totally fine with universal background checks, are totally fine. Like, I think it's only the extremes that are pushing the agenda forward and that are kind of holding all of us hostage in order to make any changes. So I think this is a present example of where we are asking schools, teachers, and kids to do the hardest part of the work, where the rest of us are kind of washing our hands of it in society. That was probably a big jump from what we were talking about, but it's a connection in my mind that's pretty present.
No, but it connects. I mean, no, it's exactly right, because we adults are asking the people who are in the middle of it to do, like you said, the hard work, and most of that falls on kids, right? Like in the end, that's who this is going to fall on. When I first started at a public school after teaching 5 years in a private school, the biggest challenge I faced was sort of getting kids to trust me. I want to ask you that, because I don't want to assume, but I will assume that you probably didn't look like a lot of the kids that you taught. I didn't look like a lot of the kids that I taught. And so for it took a little while for me to gain their trust. or for them to be like, okay, this guy really does care about what we learn, and he wants us to, to succeed. He's not against us. Did that take a while to build that trust initially in your classes each year, or not so much?
Yes, but I got better. It's a cultural thing. One, I would say my cultural adaptation skills helped me, like my ability to kind of. So it was hard at first, but I kind of picked it up because I'd done it a couple of times, and I think for any group of people, a mostly homogenous group of people, whatever that common characteristic is, when an outsider comes in, right, there's a little bit of period of adjustment of figuring that out. But I would say, yes, it took a time, but I got better at it as time went on. And what I ultimately found is that kids trust consistency. Kids trust that, I mean, kids are still forming the if then of their brains of if this happens, this is going to be the likely result. So if you as a teacher are not consistent in discipline or in rigor or in expectations, you're not safe to kids because I don't know that how I get in trouble or what I'm going to do in class today. And especially kids who experience a lot of inconsistency in their lives, they're craving safety. They're craving consistency. So if you can be a teacher who brings into the classroom consistency, order, and clear expectations, kids buy in pretty quickly. Having said that, there are also just challenges of kids who have been exposed to extreme levels of toxic stress and trauma. I think children who have experienced, we can scientifically now prove that kids who've been exposed to toxic stress over long periods of time, it changes brain chemistry. It changes the way that kids assess threats. And so while one child might see like a small disruption beside them as like, oh, that's going to be fine. Like we're just going to move on or even ignore that. For other kid, their amygdala gets hijacked. They feel like they're in a state of fight or flight instantly. And then it's harder for them to come down off of it. So then obviously behavior rises. And so that in those spaces, it becomes even more important that a teacher. And so I think to the point that I made earlier about the hardest part of the work, I think teachers can do a lot. Teachers can't do it all. Like schools can do a lot. Schools can't do it all. I think we need significant more investment within the community around those additional supports of what it takes for our brains to learn. As an ELA teacher, you know that reading happens through schema of like what you've been exposed to in the past, and that's how you gain knowledge, right? I think some texts assume you have certain, and standardized tests specifically, assume certain levels of schema that kids may or may not have been exposed to. A common saying in Memphis is that for many kids who are growing up in Memphis, they've never even seen the river, the Mississippi River that like I saw within my first 2 weeks of living in Memphis, just drove down and to go look at it. But for many kids who don't have access to transportation or exposure outside their immediate neighborhoods, that like thing that you would take for granted if you're growing up in a middle class household of the exposure to language, exposure to experiences, exposure to geography, that then all contribute to your ability to read and understand text and make meaning out of that. A lot of that stuff is missing. And so there are a lot of gaps that we have to fill when working with children from more impoverished or vulnerable backgrounds. And so it's certainly not a simple challenge. It's not a simple thing, but I think that the more awareness we bring to it and the more, I would say, dignity we provide to children and people who are experiencing poverty, the more I think we would be able to put the appropriate levels of support around that. Because I think for me, the promise of the country is not so much that there will never be any poverty ever, but I think the promise of the country is that no matter where you're from and what you look like, if you work hard and you try and you do, then you'll have an opportunity here. And I'm telling you from 15 years in education in urban school districts, that promise is failing a lot of children who are working hard every day, but just don't have the opportunities.
How did you, because you mentioned in your bio, or I read it in your bio, that you guys at Believe Charter showed the most growth in math and literacy I forgot what the exact stat was. So clearly, that's one way that you measured success. But how did you measure success in learning for your students, either in your classroom or at the charter school? And I think this will actually be a good jumping off point to talk about testing. So how did you measure that success? What was
Yeah.
successful to you?
I think interestingly, when I first started, because I started teaching in 2009, and it was kind of the kickoff point of urban education reform, charter school movement, and a lot of that momentum was built off of standards and standardized testing. And so I will say early in my career, I was a full believer in standards and standardized testing. Here's what I think they did well is one, from No Child Left Behind, signed by Bush, 2001, what it helped expose is the depth of gap between schools, between students, between districts, between communities, because now it was a federal mandate at standardized testing, right? So for those of us who grew up in the post-2000 era, standardized testing has become a part of our normal public education system. It continued after the Obama administration, 2008, and then a ton of funding got unlocked through Race to the Top. And Tennessee was a hotbed of education reform. And so, one, I want to just acknowledge that, I deeply believed in the impact of standardized testing for a couple of things. Is one, I think if we claim that we can make changes, we got to be able to measure and prove it. And so we can say all day long that our school is providing a superior educational outcome for children. If there's no way to show that and measure that, then it's really hard to convince everybody that that's happening. I think there's a usefulness to standardized testing. At the same time, the limitations that I talked about earlier of the reality is there's inherent bias in standardized tests. And we can get into that. There's a lot of studies you can look up into if you want to learn more about it. My education career, like yours, this thing called COVID happened. And that really challenged my definition of success in the middle of COVID, when we're doing virtual learning and kids are at home, and you have to ask yourself as an educator, what are we even doing? What are we even doing here? Prior to COVID, though, Tennessee specifically struggled because the implementation of Common Core was such a mess. And from the standardized testing fails of 2014 through 16, where standardized tests were ordered, canceled, not administered, literally, I think that really hurt our entire state of we say this is really important. We're going to put all this money in front of it. And then you know what? It just failed. So we're just going to not do it this year. I think everybody was like, what are we doing here? So I've really experienced a lot of kind of swing when it comes to the standardized testing. When going to your question of how did we measure success, tests were absolutely a part of it. We wanted to assess what can kids do at this moment of time when they take the test. What can they show? What can they prove? And what can they demonstrate in their learning? But the other part for me was family engagement. I think when I step out of my 15 years of education and I look back on it, and I think it takes two things to make great schools. I think it takes a really good leadership, and it takes engaged families. And I think great schools find ways to give leaders that kind of schools and school districts give school leaders empowered decision-making ability, control over staffing, because I think great teachers are everywhere, but I think teachers really connect with leaders, and I think leaders can empower, whether or not, just like a teacher in a classroom can empower her students, I think a leader in a school can empower her teachers, right? So I think it takes a really strong, clear-minded, level-set leader, and then, man, it takes family engagement. And when we talk about family engagement, I know it can be a trigger for especially thinking about communities of poverty, because the stereotype and assumption is that families are less involved. In my 15 years of education, and I've only worked in impoverished communities, I have never met a parent who is checked out of their child's education. I think parents are doing everything and the best they can, always. You're never going to convince me of that otherwise. Having said that, it looks different, right? The opportunity of a parent without transportation, a parent with hourly part-time work that cannot miss work to put food on the table, a parent who doesn't get paid if they have to go to a parent-teacher conference, and therefore that's money out of their pocket, which then affects whether they can buy groceries that week. Engagement can look different. And so I think it became on us as a school to allow for various ways of engagement, of being creative about when we do parent-teacher conferences, of doing home visits. I mean, we did very normally, like teachers and administrators would do home visits to students if there was a parent who couldn't get to the school. And then I think, in the highly politicized environment that COVID also created, we also really started thinking challengingly about like, what does the most social emotional learning look like for our kids? What does affirming our kids' identities look like in our school? Of affirming what, while this country is a majority white country, this school is a majority Black school. Like, how can we affirm the richness and cultural heritage of this community within this school and celebrate it? I think those are harder to measure, but not any less important ways to think about success when it comes to a school.
I think I have a slightly different view of testing than you do. It's probably not slightly. I was never on board with standardized testing, and that may be because of the subject that I taught. I thought it was really difficult to measure a student's, I'm going to put reading level in quotes, reading level on a standardized test like TCAP or EOC like we have right now, especially the way the standards are written today. I feel like the standards for ELA, secondary ELA, are written for kids who are in college who are English majors back when I was in college, right? Like that's who they're written for. That being said, I also believe that the impetus on standardized testing is actually hurting impoverished schools because more than likely they're not going to hit whatever that achievement level is. So then we focus on growth, but then we get hyper focused on bringing those scores up because it's going to alleviate some pressure off whoever's above us, because public education is an incredible bureaucracy, like from the top down. Like people are continuously pushing, and it always ends up on the teachers' backs or the kids' backs, which speaks to what you said earlier in the conversation. I think testing is just another example of that. And so even at my current school now, as much my job is to essentially like collect all the data from benchmark tests and common assessments and put them in the spread and analyze it. And philosophically, I'm completely against that type of education, but it's also where we are to try to get off this list. So it's this constant tension of, are we giving our kids what they really need to be learners? Or are we trying to game the system because these are just the rules we have to play by? And it's this, if it was up to me, I think we just sort of, obviously there's got to be accountability. I think the intensity of the accountability that we're being asked to meet is too much. And for reading specifically, kids are checking out because they don't give a damn about analyzing a certain text that that doesn't apply to any part of their lives. Now a good teacher can stretch and bend things to where they can grasp certain themes, but man, if it was up to me, we would read a lot of contemporary fiction, a lot of contemporary informational texts, things that are going on in the world today. And I know this is such a pie in the sky kind of deal, but as an English teacher, like I've watched over the course of really the last decade, interest in reading the text that we are required to read just drop. And if they can't engage in the text, then they can't learn to read at a deeper level. And so it's just this constant tension. Did that play any role in you starting a charter school? And I know charter schools are still held to the same accountability, and you still have to take the same standardized tests, but there is a little more autonomy. Was that part of that shift as well, or no?
Well, a couple of things, and I think this is where I'm excited to have some good conversation, healthy debate, because I think, to be fair, standards aren't written for children. Standards are written for English majors. Like, the rigor of a standard should be written for somebody who is able to understand what the standard is getting at. And so I think this gets to a bigger issue to me is teacher preparation in this country and how we view the profession of teaching and how we prepare individuals for the rigors of teaching. Because what I love about what the Sanders have done over the last 10 years is, holy cow, you have got to be like on your sharpest intellectual game to like break down a standards and understand what's so. One, it puts a whole lot more load, I agree, on a teacher to understand where the standards are pointing to. The misapplication of those standards would be to create a law where if you don't pass the TCAP, you don't pass third grade. Because what those lawmakers don't understand is these standards are written and the Tennessee assessment is made so that literally the kids passing the TCAP in third grade would be in the 75th percentile of the country or higher. So we're saying if you're not in the 75th percentile of the country, you don't get to pass the fourth grade. And the percentile is a bell curve. Not everyone can be in the 75th percentile or higher. That's lawmakers who don't understand standards in education passing a law for a political reason to gain more control over districts, because it's like, see, you're failing. Now it's going to be state takeover, which is completely ironic to me in a state that is traditionally red with conservative values that would advocate for localized control and localized decision making. So let me just first park my thing there for a second. The other thing that I would say to your question of like why I started a charter school would be going back to what I said makes an effective school is not only do you have to have effective leaders, you got to give those leaders autonomy. A leader at a school has got to be able to make decisions on what is best for that school. And so to me, it's not about lowering the bar and just letting anybody through. It's raising the bar and raising accountability, but then giving autonomy to school leaders to select curriculum, to select programs, to operate budgets, and to hire staff that are aligned with their mission. So that was number one reason. Number two reason was the parent engagement piece. Charters, by design, have to have parent engagement because parents aren't zoned to our school. You don't just accidentally end up at Believe in Us Academy. You have to sign up, and now people then will say on the other end, "Oh, you're cherry picking. You're picking the most engaged families." No, I think we're democratizing education, because I think we're giving every parent the opportunity to choose. We all, again, going back to how education is built, it's on housing. Not only do property taxes fund, but where you live determines where you go to school. For a family who's growing up in a historically disenfranchised, impoverished community, they may not want to send their child to the school that they're zoned for. But what other alternative option do they have? They can't afford to move and they can't afford private school and they don't have the resources to homeschool. What do you expect that parent to do? And what charters give is, I think, a democratization of public education to allow parents to choose. And I think that offer of choice is what gives investment. It's not that invested families just choose, but it's just that the opportunity to choose enhances their investment in the school.
And I guess my pushback on that, or my question, is not even pushback, but what about the families who might want that, but then they can't get there, right? Because and maybe it is a transportation.
I mean, that's a huge, and I think then it comes to transportation. So I think that at Believe in Us Academy, the second highest line item on our budget outside of staffing was transportation, because we saw it as mission critical that if a parent wanted to choose our school, we wanted to get your child to our school. But it was a huge line item on the budget. And so we had the opportunity for fundraising. We had the opportunity for grants and philanthropy and things like that. But to me, that should be a part of the right that comes with the charter school law, is that kids who choose charter school should be funded on providing those children transportation.
Yes, I completely agree. I want to go back to something that you said about the Believe Academy. How long were you teaching in? Was it a public school with your first? How long were you there before you started the charter?
So I started in 2009. I actually started in high school, and I was going to ask you, you're in a high school?
I am.
So when you talk about like contemporary articles, I agree. One, that becomes much more relevant in high school than elementary, middle school. Secondly, the point of like kind of interest in text, I think some of that is the battle of culture of social media and the world that we live in right now, that is a huge battle for holding a teenager's attention. So I think some of that is not the standard's fault, to be fair, of like kids losing interest in reading.
Yes.
But I also think that in high school, it is much more appropriate to be introducing contemporary text than for teachers. Again, the autonomy thing flows down to me. I think if you're teaching the right skills of reading text analysis, you should be able to do it on other skills, and you should be, whether you're reading a contemporary article. Anyway, that's a tangent between two nerds. I think how long was I? So I was from 2009 to 2016. I started in high school, moved down to middle school. I taught every grade between 3rd and 8th, taught in high school the 1 year of 11th grade, and I taught ELA or math. So I switched between the subjects. So the Common Core introduction happened while I was teaching the standards and standard assessments and things like that. And so I think all in all, I had 8 years of teaching background before I entered my fellowship program. So teaching and school leadership background before I entered the fellowship program based out of Boston called Building Excellent Schools, that trained me to found a public charter school that then we incorporated in 2016, opened with students in 2018.
Okay, so you're there from 2018 until I guess recently. I do want to go back to something, and I want to ask you about this too. Like, there's all these things. I rarely get to have honest conversations with educators and who have also taught, in a similar environment that I've taught. We had a mandated curriculum in Jackson, probably around 2017 or 18, and scripted. Up until that point, for 10 years before, I would just find my own stuff. I was finding my own stories to read because this, in ELA, all of the standards are essentially like they're wrapped up into everything, right? You have a focus one, obviously, but then you're going to hit all of them if you're teaching the right way and asking the right questions. When we had to go to that mandated curriculum, that was the first time I saw kids start to become disengaged. And it wasn't a standard issue. It was essentially a text issue. And I did understand the equity idea behind it, right? Where every kid across the whole district, they're going to be on the same thing. We have a transient population. They're going to be on the same lesson, getting the same type of instruction, diving deep into the text. I understood the theory behind that, but we were handcuffed to that. And for somebody like me, I like to be creative within the classroom. I like to figure out different. I might teach the same story, not in a totally different way, but by third block, after I've taught it 2 times, I found myself like a bunch of different other ways to communicate the standard to the kids. So it was really difficult. And I honestly think it took a lot of energy out of me. And I think that probably affected the way the kids responded to me as well. So from a curriculum standpoint, do you have a curriculum philosophy? Did you implement a certain philosophy at Believe, or did you kind of give that to the teachers?
No. I mean, okay, here's my curriculum philosophy is that curricula isn't going to be the magic silver bullet. Like, curriculum has to have, what I think a good curriculum does is it provides foundation blocks where a teacher can then take and become creative with it. Like, fundamentally, human science-wise, intrinsic motivation is driven by 3 things: autonomy, connectedness, and success, like being good at something. And so if you just tell somebody how to do it, you are scientifically going to rob motivation from that person. And when you said, like, I saw kids check out, I would argue, one, that absolutely happened. I would argue even before that, teachers started checking out. Like, teachers lost motivation when you were like telling me. For a first year teacher, that could be very helpful. Like a scripted curriculum, this is great, because I think I really believe in the principle of, like, learn how to follow the rules before you break them. I think that's why school exists. Literally, that's what school does. It teaches us how to follow the rules so that we can become adults and break them. Like, I think we but if we can't just do anarchy from like a 6th grader deciding I want to figure out how to drive, right? Like, I think, like, for first year teachers and for early teachers, it's very important to teach them how to teach. It's very important to teach them. These are the ways that you ask questions to kids to get them thinking and don't give them the answer in your question. These are the ways that you manage classroom, and all of that is really beneficial. For a 4-year plus teacher, giving the scripted curriculum, it could be helpful as a launching pad, but you got to give autonomy to teachers. So my curriculum philosophy is that curriculum's got to give the level playing field. And I think what I would argue for the transient population thing is if teachers it's a quality issue. It's like putting curriculum isn't going to solve the problem. You put quality teachers in every school in your district, it doesn't matter what text you're reading. They're going to learn, kids are going to learn. And I promise kids can adapt to whatever like texts we're reading, because the point is not the text. The point is the skills you're learning behind the text and the schema that you're building and the conversations you're having and the ways that you're challenging the way that you might be thinking, testing hypotheses, finding evidence, and then proving that through writing and refining your thinking through writing, then comparing your writing with a partner's writing and seeing what ideas they brought up, and then editing your writing and then submitting that and getting that. That's the magic, right? Mm-hmm. And I think similar to the third grade law of if you don't pass this test, you don't. I think saying you have a mandated scripted curriculum that every teacher in this district needs to teach is, I think, a surface level, dare I say, lazy level of leadership, because I think the actual problem we need to solve is, do our teachers understand what they're teaching? Are they equipped with the supports and coaching to get into the intellectual prep that it takes to teach a lesson well? And then do they have the time in the day to prepare, grade, provide meaningful feedback? Do they have the tools to do it? And I think because, so there's a business parable, right? Of like, if you want to teach a monkey how to climb a pedestal and recite Shakespeare, what would you do first? Would you train the monkey or would you build the pedestal? So many leaders build the pedestal. And it's like, it doesn't matter how nice of a pedestal you build. If you can't train an animal to recite Shakespeare, it doesn't matter. And so I think that putting curriculum is the pedestal. It looks like progress, but it's not addressing the heart of the issue.
So here's my pie in the sky argument to solve all the problems, right?
I love it.
I want to see what you think about this. What we are asking teachers in the classroom to do right now, I think, deserves a base salary of at least $80,000 to $90,000. That's your starting point. Period. You pay them commensurate to a highly trained professional job that's out there for everything else, right? At that point, then you can really start using the accountability piece as a way to, I don't want to say weed out, because I think really almost what is the most important skill a teacher can have. I think where we are right now, this is going to sound so elitist, and I don't mean it to sound that way. I think if you get a highly intelligent, creative person in the classroom, regardless of whatever teacher training program they've been through, they are going to be effective.
Yep.
Period.
100%.
And so you can teach somebody how to teach if they are, like I said, highly intelligent and creative. And then you turn them loose, right? Like you give them the basics and then you turn them loose, obviously with some parameters and the way that you want to run your school or your school district. But what I'm seeing right now is we are it's not just Jackson, it's probably everywhere. We're just wanting a warm body in some classrooms just so we have somebody there, because it's hard to be a teacher if you have a degree, especially if college loans, and live in the economic climate that we're in right now. That's my
I think what I really, really agree with is, one, I agree that is, in the world that we're in right now, is a respectable starting wage of any profession that is worth doing. I think it is difficult to make the argument when rent starts out at $1,200 a month for one-bedroom apartments, like to do anything less than that, to attract and retain talent. I think COVID definitely sped up. So when I was at Union, Jackson people remember this, a tornado came, 2008. I was one of the ones buried under the rubble for 2 hours. And so the interesting thing about the tornado is the tornado accelerated a 10-year strategic plan they already had at Union to redo the dorms. But because the tornado came, they had to go and they had to do a 10-year plan in 18 months. I think that's what COVID was. I think teaching was on a decline already. Like people were leaving the profession. That was already happening. Wages were not keeping up. We were number of people retiring versus people entering. We already saw a chasm, and then COVID blew the everything down of like, people are like, why would I go into teaching? Making 40, 50,000 dollars a year less, when I have student loans, when I have other things, so I do think there's a real, issue. I think where people are going to say like, yeah, but they've done studies. Just paying teachers more doesn't solve the problem. That's true. Like, just paying teachers more won't just solve the problem, but it is a step, and it's going to have long-term ramifications. The other side, I 100% agree. Well, I think here's the premise that I deeply agree with. Two premises I really agree with. One is that not everyone can be a teacher.
No.
It's too hard. It's too intellectual. It's too skilled. Not everyone can be a teacher. Not everyone can be a good teacher. And right now we're in a desperate situation where so many people are leaving the profession and not enough are entering, that we just got to find anybody willing and put them in a classroom. But that is a short-term solution to an emergency and a crisis. But the long-term solution is we've got to make teaching attractive for the most creative and intelligent people in our community and society, because that's what the profession needs and deserves. So I really agree with that. I also agree with the premise of just like what it takes to live and build a career and a family today. And then the other side of it is, I see, and please do not discount the first two things that I said, because people are going to say, aha, see, I see teachers all the time taking pay cuts to go work at a private school, where they have more supports, where they have more autonomy, where they have smaller class sizes, and where they will have more sanity in their life. And so just paying people more is not enough, because it's not a lasting enough motivation. We've got to also do the hard work of making teaching sustainable for people and humans who are trying to do the work of manageable class sizes and loads and planning periods during the day, and opportunities to take PTO and go to friends' weddings without feeling guilty. And like, that is a system change. Like, we've just got to fundamentally change, because the world has changed. If the profession doesn't keep up with it, it will die. And I think parents are also choosing those different options. Parents who can choose are choosing different options, because they see what teachers are providing for their children. So please hear me say, yes, we need to pay teachers more. We need to make it more sustainable, and it by itself will not solve the problem.
That is what that third point you hit on. That's exactly right. Because I made the comment today to somebody at my school, and I said, we don't treat teachers like professionals. For whatever reason, the system of education, the bureaucratic setup of it's almost like we see how teachers treat students, but then administration treats teachers like they treat students, and then district personnel treats principals like, it's like this theory of displacement, right? Like, everybody just pushes the other one down who's lower a little bit. It's this weird power dynamic, but we've got to start treating teachers like professionals. Like, we've hired them, we're literally paying them tens of thousands of dollars to do a job. Now, obviously they need support, but we've got to change our mindset and treat them like every other, I don't want to say corporation, but in the corporate world, they don't treat their professional employees the way public education treats their teachers, at least in my experience. Now, this is I've been in one district, and I'm not saying anything bad about my district. I'm just saying that seems to be the way it's laid out. I do want to ask you one more question, because it's late. You've got to get wherever you've got to get. It's almost 10. This has been an incredible conversation. I could probably keep going another hour.
Yeah. We'll just schedule another one.
Yes, like I mean that sincerely. What do you think? And we hadn't even gotten into why you ended up leaving education. Maybe we'll save that for another time.
Sure.
What do you think the most significant challenges to public education in Tennessee, and I'll just say Tennessee specifically because that's where we are, what are the most significant challenges to public education right now, September 11th, 2024, and moving forward?
There, as you and I could go on for another 2 hours on, there's a myriad of challenges, but I think it stems from this core challenge, and it gets to the heart of what you just said. So I'll couch it in this. So I was listening to a podcast with the women who created this Netflix show. This is two sisters from East Texas, and they're two African American sisters, and one went off to Sicily and studied art, and then got married and came back. And it's a mini series about their life of growing up in East Texas as Black women, trying to make life and career and all of those things. It was based on a book. It was one of the most successful Netflix series. I mean, during COVID, it was one of the top 10 show, very successful, won a bunch of awards. So the two sisters were producers on the show. And the interviewer asked them the question, you all were so successful. And one of the things that really struck me about this show is that you were able to be so honest in the show. How did you do that? And one of the sisters said, from every level of the production, from Netflix to, it was, I think, Reese Witherspoon's company that was the production company as well, to that company, when we shared our experience, people believed us. The problem in education right now is when teachers like you, administrators, leaders, share our story, people don't believe us. The lawmakers, district officials think that they know better and don't believe the stories of what it's like to be on the front lines. And in any operation, if you have a disconnect between people in the front lines to the people making the strategy, it's going to fail. And I think it goes back to the professionalism and respecting the professionalism. You have this group literally from Hillsdale, the president of the university mocks people in their education, in his school, his own college's school of education. He mocks them and their intelligence. This was recorded on a state level conversation with our governor. And that group is still getting a group of charters in our state. And one's opening in Jackson. And I think we have lawmakers, we have, you have that interview with it's on both sides. You have an interview with the New Jersey, Chris Christie, who a teacher is kind of going on a rant about how hard it is. And Chris Christie looks at him and goes, well, find another job. That's exactly what's happening is people are just going to find another job. You continue to receive disrespect in your place of work, people are going to leave. And one of the greatest forms of disrespect is not being believed when you tell your story and when you tell your truth. I think we've got to listen to our teachers and we got to listen to our school leaders when we're saying this isn't working and it's not sustainable and we've got to make changes.
Danny, I enjoyed every part of this conversation. This has been the longest one of these I've done, but it honestly feels like the shortest. So thank you so much. And like I said, I could keep going. I know it's 10 o'clock and you've got to get your
We'll
car.
have to pour something else if we're going to keep going, and I need to move locations in order to do that. But yeah, next time, I would love to. I also, Gabe, it was great to meet you, and man, great to meet another JCM grad and alum. I think that people who graduate from JCM between the 90s and 2000s are just the greatest people in the world.
It has been. There's not a lot of people who know that story, and you spoke it so well. You were in the middle of that transition, and a lot of people think that was. And I didn't put this in the text that we were texting yesterday. A lot of people think that split, starting Madison and Liberty, was sort of the straw that finally broke the camel's back. I would argue I was part of consolidation when city and county merged in, I think, 91, 92. And there was there were a lot of people who went to private schools then. And that was sort of the start of that. And then you fast forward to 2004, over a decade, that was at the point, I believe, where the sort of the tipping point of this situation happened. And look, this is a whole other conversation, but going back to what you said about the civil rights movement and education being the main civil rights issue of today, you could look at Jackson and Madison County right now and say that we're back to being a segregated county. For all intents and purposes, with private schools and our public schools. And it's almost like we've come, taken a 180.
It's sad. And it's actually, I think we don't realize what we're missing out on. I think we're scared of change, but I think all of us are being disturbed by this segregation. I think separation and segregation hurts us more than we realize.
Danny, thanks so much. Be safe with your travels.
Thank you so
your
much.
time in Dallas.
It's been a pleasure.
Let's do this again.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thanks a lot, man.
All right, see you again.